Hello, my name's Cliff Freilich. I am the Executive Director of Cinema St. Louis, and we're the presenters of the 29th Annual Whitaker St. Louis International Film Festival. We're delighted to be joined by several people who are associated with the terrific documentary Lights of Baltimore. So let me introduce them one by one. First, the director and producer, Sabrina Bouarour. One of the subjects of the film, Verna Myers. And then last, but absolutely not least, co-producer Beau Willimon, who you might be familiar with as a showrunner on the first four seasons of House of Cards, Oscar-nominated screenwriter for Ides of March, and also a former St. Louisan. Welcome to all of you. I'm going to start logically with Sabrina. Sabrina, you obviously are, well, not so obviously yet, it will become apparent that you're French, and you're currently residing in Paris, but you were in Baltimore when you were making this film. So just talk a little about the origins of the film, what motivated you to make it, what you were doing at the time. And just give us a little backstory as to why you decided to make this particular film.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cliff. So I got to go to Baltimore in 2013 because I was starting my PhD at La Sorbonne, but I started in Baltimore through an exchange program with Johns Hopkins University. So I was a visiting scholar there, and I got fascinated by the city. I think the city is great, it's mysterious. There are so many things to see, to explore in terms of art, with like the street art, like the Baltimore club music. And so I was interested in exploring more the city. So when I started the film, my first idea was to do a film on the artistic responses to the Baltimore uprising. So I started meeting people who were doing a mural project in Suntown where the uprising happens. That's how I met with Verna. And so I was very interested in the art scene and how the people were working together, doing art together. And then I attended the Freddie Gray's trial. So I got to attend the trial for several months. I was really interested in knowing better the city, and this was the best way of understanding better the city. So I got to know people there who helped me to show the divisions in the city. And so step by step, the film has changed a lot. And I was supposed to stay 1 year in Baltimore, and I stayed 4 years.
Okay, and obviously the scope of the film just kept getting wider and wider and wider. And also you offer a really fascinating historical perspective, which I think is hugely important. So we'll talk about that momentarily. So let's move on first to Beau. Beau, can you talk a little bit about how you became involved in the project? I know it was a little late in the game, and what your own connections are to Baltimore and why you found it important to be involved in this particular project.
Thanks, Cliff. And let me just say, honored to be associated with this film and to be part of the St. Louis International Film Festival as a St. Louisan who grew up on the mean streets of the Loop, and going to the Tivoli and the High Point and all the great art houses in St. Louis. The International Film Festival in St. Louis has always been near and dear to my heart. So it's a real honor and also just personally rewarding for me, to be here chatting with you and Renee and Sabrina about this film. I was filming House of Cards in Baltimore when Freddie Gray murder happened. And I got to know Sabrina around the same time because she was, among other things, she's a journalist, and she wrote an article for Le Monde about House of Cards and interviewed me. And we stayed in touch. We became friends. And so we were in touch over the years, and she, I knew, was working on this film. And at a certain point, she said, "I have a film to show you. Would you take a look?" And I did, and was so impressed by what I saw, particularly by the fact that Sabrina really approached this in a holistic way, and not just purely a journalistic sort of play-by-play of, what happened, how did we get here, and where did it lead to, but a more subjective reality of, you know, how do people respond to this emotionally? How do they respond to it psychologically? What are the positive things that have come out of this, as well as all of the damage, of course, that we've seen along the way? There is a very honest approach to the toxicity in a place like Baltimore, but there is also a lot of revelations in terms of hope and paths to not only coping with this sort of cultural tumult, but also pathway strategies for learning from it and improving. So all of that being in one film was something I felt was extraordinary. I know that, you know, at that time, Sabrina was interested in finding a home for the film. And so my production company came on board to help with the sort of final stages of post-production, and then begin the path for finding distribution. Of course, part of that strategy is the festival route. And so we're really just delighted to be part of the St. Louis International Film Festival in our hopes of finding a greater audience for the film.
Terrific. And now let's turn to Verna. Verna, just give us a little background on, you do lots of things. So talk a little bit about your background and then how you and Sabrina ended up connecting and you becoming one of the many voices that's woven into the film.
Thank you, Cliff. I'm here. I'm so excited to be here. I grew up in Baltimore City and then spent a good deal of time in Boston and came home about 8 years ago or 9 years ago because as a former attorney and as presently a person who owned her own business and worked with companies and other institutions around inclusion and diversity and equity, I wanted to come back to my city and to see what it was that I could do to make things better. And also my family is there, so I really wanted to have an opportunity to see them, to hang out with them. And you know, I wasn't home long before I started to recognize some of the deep issues in Baltimore that somehow, coming back and forth on Thanksgiving and Christmas, I didn't quite fully grasp. Even hearing the stories of my nieces and nephews, I hadn't put all the systemic things together. And but when I came back, and it's interesting that we're doing this in St. Louis, because the way it went is that I had gone to St. Louis and was doing a book talk and had a chance to do a tour in Ferguson, and to hear from what so many people in the community was saying. And I came home that evening and the Freddie Gray uprising began. And I just was like, wow. As a part of that, I started to figure out, like, what could I do? And I started working with a person named J.C. Falk, who had a group called An End to Ignorance, and he was doing something called Circles of Voices. And I think, Sabrina, that's where we first met, but I don't know, because there was a lot of, JC was also part of creating a lot of wall art, street art, and it was beautiful. And it was a chance for people to voice how they feel about the city and how they feel about the injustices and so forth. And Sabrina was part of that too. So we had many touch points, but I just enjoyed her openness and her curiosity to understand what was going on and to really hear the stories of people on the street. And I think that the film captures so much of the polarities pretty much in the city, you know, the good, the bad, the ugly, the beautiful, and it doesn't try to make it one thing. And I think that's the hardest part when we're trying to tackle these problems, is that we make people like either the enemy or the ones who are beyond reproach. You know, we try to figure out who's the right one and who's the wrong one. And it's kind of this binary approach to something that is so much more complex and so intersectional. So I think she did a beautiful job. I think the film does a great job, and of really trying to play out those various narratives in a much more comprehensive way. And I think that's the beginning of our understanding and our healing. I also want to say, Beau, you blew it telling people that House of Cards is really filmed in Baltimore. Well, if you're in Baltimore, you know that House of Cards. Great, great, great show. Thank you. Oh, and my day job, I work at Netflix.
One of the many things that you do, yes.
I work on inclusion for Netflix.
Okay, great. Let's turn to you, Sabrina. As has been referenced by both Beau and Verna, this is a really densely packed film. There's a lot of material that's contained within it. It's again, you sort of very much show the complexity of the city. You're not being reductive at all. You arrived at that slowly, obviously. One of the sort of entry points, obviously, was that the art that was being generated. And we do see plenty of it. It ends up appearing in the film quite frequently, but you don't obviously emphasize it from the point of view of making it a central portion of this movie. But one of the things that is central is your discussion of social media, its impact on how protest is done now, contrasting it with the approach the traditional media took during the civil rights era. And then also part and parcel with all of that is the surveillance culture that is also very much a part of Baltimore in many, many, many large cities now. And Lights of Baltimore is actually, of course, a reference to sort of the beginnings of all of that. The fact that the street lamps were intended as a means of making the city safer. And people argue, of course, that something like the intrusive surveillance is intended to do exactly the same thing. So anyway, that's a long windup. Talk a little bit about the evolution of the film and how you lighted on those particular aspects to focus on, and then your thoughts currently on social media and surveillance.
So thank you so much, Guy, for the nice words. I'm really honored to be part of this panel with you. I'm excited. So as Beau told you before, so I'm a doctor in film studies, but before I was a journalist. So I'm really into into news, into following everything online. And so when the Baltimore uprising happened, I was back in Paris, and I followed everything through social media and through through all the mainstream medias, and I could see a big discrepancy between what my friends were in Baltimore were posting on Facebook, on Twitter. I didn't have Instagram at the time, but on social media, and what the mainstream media were reporting. So I was really interested in seeing, so when I came back to Baltimore, I was really interested in meeting people, in meeting journalists, in meeting historians, in meeting people from the communities to have their point of view, to understand better what happened. That was really my, what I wanted to do, was to understand what happened. And the best way to do was to meet a lot of people and to hear their voices. So that's why, I think that the fact of being a journalist, and I decided at some point to stop being a journalist, and I started a PhD program. And I felt like the film was really at the intersection of being a journalist and knowing, the practice, knowing how to interview people, how to ask questions. And at the same time, I was doing my research for my PhD, which had no connection with Baltimore. So that's how I started digging into the archives and trying to meet more historians. And that's how I really, that's what I wanted to do, was to have a better understanding of the situation with a present point of view, with the people in Baltimore in 2015. And with, of course, I wanted the big picture. I wanted to have the context and the socio-historical and political context that was underneath everything.
Okay, let's start unpacking some elements of this. Obviously, there's great value in social media because obviously a lot of the activism that took place around the Black Lives Matter movement, not just in Baltimore but elsewhere, was generated through social media. But obviously, there are also downsides to social media. We're seeing plenty of them within the context of the presidential campaign that we're still in process, even though by the time people watch this, it'll be over. So we don't know what the result is. I'm curious as to where you fall and how you think that you mentioned, for example, in the film, that we didn't see endless loops of people rioting when the civil rights, when the initial upset in the mid 60s and late 60s occurred in American cities. Uprisings then were handled differently by the media because it was a different world. So you just had glimpses on the television news, and there were only 3 major channels, whereas now we get endlessly repeated this material. I am assuming that you think that it's good that we now have an alternative means of accessing information through social media, but do you also worry about the direction that social media is now headed?
Of course, and you probably know that 2 weeks ago in France, like a history professor was killed after in a terrorist attack in a high school in the suburbs of Paris. And this happened because some information were shared on social media. So I'm really critical about social media, and I think they are important because they are an alternative way of having news, and you can have more accurate news if you follow the right people. But I think it needs to be more controlled, and I'm really worried about that. But right now I'm in France, and with all the crazy context, I don't really want to talk myself about that. So I will let Beau and Verna talk about this because, you know, we just had like a curfew, a new lockdown since yesterday, and we had the terrorist attack yesterday in Nice. So social media, I don't really want to talk about this right now. I'm sorry.
Well, Verna and Beau, would either of you like to sort of weigh in? Obviously, the film does deal with that aspect quite prominently at different stages in the film.
Beau, do you want to go, or I can go first?
Go ahead.
I mean, I have to say that in this situation, and especially in the situations of people who don't own or control the production of of media, that, you know, social media becomes the democratization of the storytelling. And that is, you never are more in need of democratization than when something like an unrest happens in a place where people have already obviously been seen as you know, like throwaway. Like there's a lot of attitudes, clumping, like stereotyping, biases. And so in some ways, the only way to get like a fresh idea about a group of people or about what's happening is to have those individuals have some say about what they're showing. And I remember distinctly, so I live downtown, right? So in downtown, you couldn't even tell there was unrest except for the tanks, you know, protecting the properties, you know, the commerce, right? People were jogging, right? And there were like police and so forth, but there was none of the activity that did ultimately happen. People did learn to come downtown, but I live downtown, people were walking their dogs, they were also jogging. I'm looking at CNN, and finally I'm like, you know what? For the very first time in a lot of these situations, I actually can go up the street and see what's going on. And when I went up the street to Penn and North, which was probably at the most 3 miles from my house. And the world is so different in 3 miles in Baltimore because it's all about sort of like how they've patterned the neighborhoods. And I saw something that was so completely different than what was being reported on CNN. And I could see CNN, and I could see what they were filming, and I could see what they were missing. And the thing that they were missing that social media captured, Periscope, all those different groups, was this fabulous, almost like a town hall that was happening on the streets with clusters of people having real conversations about what is the right way to approach injustice, what is the right way. And there would just be like pods of people in the street talking, not violent at all. And so I was like, wow, they'll just never see this on TV. But I could also tell, like my son would say to me, oh, mom, we're going to so-and-so, so-and-so. I'm like, how do you know what's going on there? He's like, I'm looking at it. Someone's streaming this corner. And I was just like, as an older person, I'm like, what? People are, so for me, it has all of those benefits. But of course, it also has all of the downside. And really what we're looking for people to do is to just be better at how critical and constructive they are about what they are watching and listening. And the hope is that if you have a number of channels and they're all kind of different, that you'll get the whole picture. But sometimes the problem is that people get very much into like one stream or one group of people, and then they kind of cut off their curiosity.
Oh, you're a very politically active person as well, in addition to your creative work. You no doubt have many thoughts on this issue. Do you want to offer a few?
Well, I think Sabrina and Verna have said a lot of what I would have said, and better. But I will. I think Verna brought up a very important point: the difference between what you're seeing and what's actually happening. We were filming in Baltimore at the time of the uprising, and I lived in Harbor East. Her description of people drinking their lattes and jogging and going about their days is 100% accurate. We filmed quite a few times, not during the uprising itself, obviously, but in the neighborhood where it was mostly focused. And so I was very familiar with that part of town. And yet, not even 3 miles away, like 3 blocks away, you wouldn't necessarily know that like an uprising was happening. And I use quotes on uprising. I think that's the proper term, but mostly to point a finger at how charged our semantics are about all of these things. What you're seeing on the mainstream media at that time was talking more about riots, right? Which is absolutely wrong. And riots sort of puts the agency in the hands of protesters as these sort of people that are just running rampant throughout a town and burning it down. The protesters did have agency, but were doing so in a very targeted and organized way for the most part. Now, whenever you have a frayed situation, there's always the opportunity that some things are going to get a little out of control. But for the most part, the protests that were happening subsequent from the initial days of unrest were very organized, deliberate, thoughtful activities of people speaking up about systemic problems in Baltimore, right? And anyone in St. Louis would know that when Ferguson happened, the news was reporting like St. Louis is burning down. Well, I think many St. Louisans didn't even know where Ferguson was at that time. It's one of like 50 municipalities that's sort of peppered around the outskirts of St. Louis County. Subsequent to the Ferguson, initial days of unrest, I was home visiting and I drove through Ferguson, and I never even would have known it was a town because it's basically one street with strip malls along the way that bleeds into another municipality. Like Ferguson became something that was in the national spotlight because you had National Guardsmen, because you had tear gas and crowd control munitions, and because people were standing up in a serious way, in a sustained way. You're seeing that in Portland right now and other cities, but Portland, which we've heard a lot about, is people are talking about like, oh, the city's burning down. Same thing there. If you're 3 blocks away from Lowndes Square, you would never know that people are sustaining 4 hours of tear gas at a time. And every night there, a riot is declared, even though the actions themselves are quite deliberate and organized and targeted. When we think about these things, oftentimes even a more liberal leaning media will say things like protesters clash with police, for instance. What if you reverse that? Police clash with protesters. What if you think about the people that are actually engaging in rioting being law enforcement? You know, these ways of thinking about things, I think opens our mind up to what actually happened and looking at it from different perspectives and reminding ourselves that the camera tends to gravitate towards things like fire, like a car burning or a dumpster burning, when the actual real story, like Verna is saying, is several hundred people gathered having a conversation. But your camera, and I know this as a storyteller, is going to go towards the most salacious thing. And then that is used as agitprop along the entire political spectrum from left to right. And so these events that are so specific and felt by a community become these sort of symbolic playthings by people with varying agendas. And what Sabrina, I think, has done so well is reminded us this is a real place with real people that have real stakes who don't, they're not leaving this community. They're not parachuting in, getting a little bit of film and leaving. This is their lives. This is their future and it's their past. And they have to live with that. And to really feel that in such a fulsome way is why documentaries like this are so important.
And I think a really terrific example of that is the sort of follow-up. You know, we hear on the news, the CVS pharmacy is looted, but we don't see, as we see in the documentary, that the people within the community then come in and actually clean that CVS up because they realize that it's an important element in that community and they take their own action to help restore it. Sabrina, so I thought that was a particularly important scene for people to witness. I thought it was quite central. Sabrina, I want to talk a little bit about some of your formal choices. We'll talk more about the important things that the film's grappling with, but I do want to give props to some of the choices that you made as a filmmaker. I thought particularly terrific was your use of those multiple images that multiply like a matrix on the screen. I'm curious, and you use them really deft and interesting ways, and sometimes in different ways depending on what subject you're talking about. Can you talk a little bit about how you arrived at that decision to use that approach to helping tell the story?
Yes, of course. So just before, I just would like to comment something that Beau said, and I think it's important. The words are important, like uprising, riots, unrest. They were these words that were present all the time. And the words are very political, very important. And when I was reading about what happened in April 2015 from France, the only word that was used was riots. So when I used in my first email, like the riots in Baltimore, people in Baltimore got offended. And I understood later why they were offended, because of course, there were like weeks of protests, weeks of peaceful protests. So it was important to emphasize the positivity, and especially in Baltimore, when they were protesting, they were like dancing, they were playing music, they were very positive, very Baltimore about that. So I think the words are very important. So I just wanted to, to comment
Sure.
that. And regarding the multiple images, I was trying to find a way of showing that we were like, there were so many videos shared online. There were so many points of view, but there was really like, usually I don't watch television, like I mean news channel. I prefer reading like, I read the New York Times because I prefer having my images. And I feel like, you know, with like, especially with like the, like CNN and everything, you basically see an images and then it stays in your mind and you just keep the violence in mind. So I was trying to find a way of showing like the violent images that were shown all the time, like all day long, and then to show that there was a bigger picture to see. And this was like the pictures from 1968 and the pictures from the past and the fact that the past is the present. So I was teaching James Baldwin to my student last week, and we're working on the Fire Next Time, and with I Am Not Your Negro by Raoul Peck. And this is exactly that. This is like the importance of the past, and especially in Baltimore, because what is really striking in the city is that there is so much history everywhere, but nobody understands, like nobody knows about it. And this is something that is crazy, to have the access to the 1968 images of like unrest of in Baltimore. Like it was kind of difficult at the beginning, you know, to dig into the archives and to find the archives. But there are some people who are like really fighting in the city to keep the archive. Like there is an organization, Marmia, who works on like trying to preserve the past of the city. And I used the WJZ old footage from Baltimore in '68, and I could use this because there was a group of people who are putting time and work on like preserving these archives, but there wasn't so much support. Like I think they got a grant recently, but they were like, I was helping Chavan, like they had like big, you know, like big boxes with like, you know, all the archives, and each time I was opening an archive, I was just like, oh my God, this is the past. And so, but we were working, you know, with these boxes, and I was just like, this is crazy. We are basically preserving, like helping to organize the boxes, whereas there should be more support about that. So, yeah. So it was really interesting in finding a way of showing the connection between the past and the present in the city.
And I thought that did a wonderful job of accomplishing that. I thought it was really a deft use of those multiple images to move back and forth between the contemporary images and the past, and it makes really explicit those connections. I also wanted to chat before we move into the larger issues. I thought you did a really wonderful job also with the music, and you have a couple of musical interludes with songs that, as I discovered while watching the end credits, that you wrote the lyrics for. Talk a little bit about the decision to do that, to have those sort of parts of the film in which we sort of pull back and see the city in a different way and have it overlaid with those songs. Talk a little bit about how you reached that decision.
So my PhD was on musicals and drama, so I'm a little bit obsessed with musical and with music. And I was like lucky enough and honored to work with Julie Rouet, who is a French composer, and all the music is original, like all the songs, like I wrote the lyrics, Julie Rouet sings, and I sing too, like I do all the chorus. And I wanted, so the thing is that for my PhD, I worked on Jacques Demy, who is a French filmmaker who made a film called The Umbrellas of Cherbourg. And this was a big reference for the film because I had like several themes, and you cannot, like, basically it helped me when I was editing, but we have several themes that changes all along the film. So I asked Julie to add like some, for example, there is like a theme for like surveillance. And this starts at the beginning with like this, like a neutral theme. And then she added some instruments. And there is, for example, like the violence from in 2004 and 2015, we have like a particular music, and she added some instrument for the violence in '68. So this was a way of showing that there is like this repetitive history, but there were some things changing, and that's how Julie was like adding more instrument, or with surveillance, she worked on like metallic sounds. So it was really interesting to work on the music. I think this was my favorite part because it was really, I was working all the time with Julie. Like I created a Spotify playlist with like a lot of like classical songs, but there was also Beyonce, Rihanna, like a lot of different artists from the US, from France, from Italy. And she was like, I was talking with her through like by sharing these songs, and I was telling her what I liked in the songs, and then she was trying several things. I was sending her like pictures, colors, things that I liked, and this helped her to create the atmosphere. So we had like, before editing, she created some music, and then during the editing, she worked again on the music. So it was really like she started before editing, during editing, and even in the end, she was like, she's so perfectionist that she basically changed a lot of things in the end. She wanted to make it perfect.
I don't know that many people would have recognized the Jacques Demy's influence over Lights of Baltimore, so I'm glad you pointed that out to us. All right, so let's now address some of the very serious issues that the film tackles. One of them, of course, is the police violence and the way in which policing occurs, particularly in Black communities. It seems like Baltimore's police force recognizes the problems. They talk a good game. The people that you have on camera speaking certainly say all the right things, but ultimately, particularly Verna is being a resident of Baltimore right now. What do you think of the progress or lack thereof that's being made on that front? Do you think that the police actually do get it? And are they taking the necessary steps to correct this, ongoing misbehavior?
Yeah. So I don't know if I can speak with any authority about what they're doing, what they're not doing. I know that Sabrina started this before the Justice Department did the report on Baltimore. It was scathing, like unbelievably horrible patterns of behavior against groups, like 5 blocks. Like it was just the occupation, the surveillance, the basically like control of folks coming and going, and therefore, and then we somehow wonder why they have more arrests, or why, like if I stake your neighborhood out 24/7 and put a bunch of cameras in it, I bet your crime numbers will go up too, right? But also just the emotional trauma of having this force in your neighborhood. So, the killings and the maimings, we don't even talk about the maimings. Like, there are people being maimed and their lives and their enjoyment being ended constantly by police, not just in Baltimore, and a lot of places. We don't hear too much about that. Like the cities are often just paying families off. We hear some of it, but not a lot. And so what we need to do, what we would need to do would have to be so comprehensive. People say community policing, yes, but you still have to have people who love a group, who love human beings, and a group of people who psychologically are prepared to deal with some of the results of the kinds of racism, right? Because that's unfortunately what a lot of police are asked to do, is to handle the ills of society that no one else is paying attention to, and they're not trained to do it. So now I understand that the training is supposed to be different. A lot of what happened, so no one was held responsible for Freddie Gray's death, which to me is continuously the most painful thing imaginable. That a person is alive and then they go under the custody of police and then they sustain the type of injuries that cause them to die. Like, how is that no one's fault? But as a result, part of that is the police. And that is very, very difficult. And a number of people who are in your film, Sabrina, are no longer in the police department, or no longer in charge, at least, of the police. So they've been doing some cleaning, they've been doing some changing, some training. But it's a system, and it's a system within a system. And there's a lot of fear, and that fear just causes these groups to get more and more militaristic. And that's not what we need. What we really need is to examine the ways in which we have underserved these communities, and how they are, and I don't know what COVID is going to do, but it's going to be worse, and how to meet those needs, those social needs. And until we do that, I don't see how things are going to improve in a meaningful way, but I'm hopeful. So I am now living in LA, And so, and I've been back and forth, but I haven't sort of gotten the most recent read on where some of the initiatives have gotten us. But if it's like every other place in America, I would say that we still haven't done the reckoning that we have to do.
Would you like to join in the conversation on that front?
Verna brings up a really important point about police unions. One of the hats I wear is I'm president of the Writers Guild of America East. We are an affiliate of the AFL-CIO. One of the largest unions in the AFL-CIO is the IUPA, the International Union of Police Associations, which represents over 100,000 police officers, mostly in the Southeast. And then many of the other unions in the AFL-CIO, large industry unions that typically represent workers that are doing things like steelwork or trade union jobs, also have police unions within them as affiliates. There are over 800,000 cops in this country, and they all belong to unions, and all those unions fight really hard to protect their members, which are what unions theoretically are supposed to do. But the values of police unions are directly opposed to the values of labor, right? The labor movement has a long history of racism and sexism for sure. But on the whole, over time, has moved into much more progressive territory. And at its heart, has always been about justice and equity. And then it's expanded the scope of who that should apply to over time. But police unions are actually, in a way, the muscle for management, for the capitalist state, for the people who have a vested interest in oppression. When you have unions that are on strike or protesting, who breaks them up? Cops who are in their own unions. Now, I don't want to go too long about unions, but it goes to the heart to the systemic structures that Verna was talking about. And what we've seen, especially since the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, is the surfacing of things like abolition. Now, the abolition movement, when it comes to the carceral system, there's nothing new about that. That goes way back. But in terms of it making it into the mainstream consciousness, that is relatively new, and you have people out there on the streets who run the political spectrum from moderate police reform to complete and utter abolition. And abolition for many people is still like a alien concept, like from Mars. Like, how does that even work? Even myself, I'm a, an activist to a degree, like was not as familiar as I should be, but even opening our minds up to what that would even look like, I think moves us in the right direction. Police reform is an oxymoron to many people. When you talk about moderate police reform or moderate defunding of the police, that's not how you change systems. So if you really want to address the problem in a serious and sustained way, we have to look at radical reform. That might mean different things to different people. But knocking down a police budget by 5% or sending a few social workers in a few instances for optics ain't gonna cut it.
All right. Sabrina, did you want to say anything on that front?
Yeah, so to follow what Verna was saying, when I was filming in Baltimore, so I was filming before the Freddie Gray's trial and after. So of course, people in Baltimore got so frustrated by the fact that no police officer was held accountable. So this was really frustrating and really awful. But it was like when Marilyn Mosby decided to quit the trial because she could see that no police officer would be found guilty. I think it was like 1 month later that the DOJ report revealed the whole situation in the city. And I was so honored to have Laurie Robinson in my film, to have the opportunity to interview her, because she was the co-chair of the Obama's task force on the police reform. And she was really shocked at the DOJ report results, like showing that for years, for decades, people were living in such a terrible situation where their everyday lives rights were basically violated. This was really, and what was strange is that like the DOJ report was interesting. It was Obama who decided to really say, okay, for a year we will meet the people in Baltimore, like the police officer, who will see how the police work, who will meet with the communities, and but it's as if nobody was believing the people in Baltimore, what the people were saying for years, for decades. So I think it was something really important. But now we don't really understand what is happening with the police reform in Baltimore. There are so many things going on at the same time that it's very difficult.
Yeah, making any progress is very difficult in this context, especially. And Beau's point about the police unions and their sort of stranglehold over movement forward is unfortunately all too accurate. I wanted to talk at one point in your film, toward the latter part, one of the people you interview says this is really unique to Baltimore, and I disagreed. Because when I was watching the film, so many of the problems that you unpack in Baltimore are reflected very starkly here in St. Louis, and that's the case in Chicago and in Philadelphia and across the entire United States. These same issues apply. So I'm just curious, it can at times be a very pessimistic thing to think through. Is this ever going to change? Are we going to actually see any forward movement? So I want to conclude this, and I know I've kept you all pretty long here, with your thoughts on the future, whether or not you remain optimistic or pessimistic about the really necessary reforms, the tearing down of that systemic racism that so pervades our society, or do you see glimmers of hope or not? And talk a little bit of the reasons why. So we'll start with you, Sabrina.
So I'm French, so I should be pessimistic. But I won't, because I'm especially, and right now, like everything is difficult everywhere, but I stay really hopeful, because I know that there are a lot of people who are doing things to change the system. And I think that doing meaningful things, working, teaching, like reading books, watching films, having opportunities to talk, to exercise your critical thoughts and everything. With this, we have an opportunity to change things. But I think we really need to have like more opportunities to talk, to have conversation. And that's why I really hope that my film will help to create a conversation, even with people with whom you disagree with. And I think this is something that we need, because it's too easy to talk only with the people you agree with. And I think it's important to disagree, but to disagree politely, and to have a way of talking and arguing. And again, I'm French, so like we argue all the time, and I think it's something cultural that is important. And I think that it's really to have more opportunity to talk, to have conversation is very important to change things.
Renee?
Yeah, I was thinking about a story that I heard on NPR during the time I was in Baltimore, about how this guy was who was part of the community, and a community activist was walking with a reporter, and the reporter said, was pointing to all of the abandoned homes in the houses and the burned out homes. And the guy who's the community guy said, I bet you you can't tell me which of these houses was burned because of Freddie Gray, and which of them were burned in the 1960s. And, you know, when people say, what's wrong with those people? I don't understand why they burn up their own neighborhoods. There's not a lot in their neighborhoods, right? I mean, and that is the painful reality that we just keep watching this rotation. And it's the same people over and over again who benefit, and the same people over and over again who are deeply harmed and disadvantaged by the intentional decisions we make about who's going to live where and what road is going through what and what kind of buses are going to be available and all of that, like someone sitting and making those decisions over and over again. And so I think, especially and sadly, because of the way George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were taken from us, there is a new curiosity, new stories. People are availing themselves, like Sabrina said, to new understandings. They're seeing that this is a long, long embedded practice. It's not like some all of a sudden, and it's not about people being responsible. You know, it's like, I don't care how responsible you are. If you go to Baltimore, you see people at 5 a.m., they're on the bus stop going to their third job. I mean, how much more responsible can you be? So I'm thinking that there is this opportunity. And what I am saying is, please, let's not let this opportunity slide by. Everybody's got to educate themselves, has to create those kinds of relationships that they've never had before, have to decide they're going to be true allies and throw in, become a solidarity partner and help the groups of people who are unfairly disadvantaged and subjected to such injustice. Like, this is the time. And this is a time not just to help those people, but to help us in our nation and what we say we want to be and in our larger society and the larger world. And this has reverberations all over the world. All over the world. These are the conditions that a lot of people are suffering from. And so I'm just an optimistic person, but in that optimism, I am reminded of the resilience of my ancestors and of the people who I consider to be part of my family, which are anybody who's up for fighting for justice. I don't care what color you are. But we have to do it. And I think if we do it, we can make a huge change. But if we are asking someone else to do it, we won't. And I thank Sabrina for doing her part of really elucidating this whole thing, because I think when people watch it, they'll go, oh, I never thought about that.
And Beau, that's quite an act to follow, but would you like to also weigh in?
I'm not going to try to follow it, other than to say what Verna said gives me hope, with a healthy dose of reality in there. We have to be realists as much as optimists. That's where real hope comes from. And you can't despair, because when you despair, they win. That's what they want. They want you to give up. You know, now there's a lot of people I've spoken to, BIPOC activists, young and old, who are fatigued, tired, worn down. That's real. We have to acknowledge that. You know, their attempts to oppress all walks of life, but particularly the BIPOC community, work all too often. And that's what we're up against. But hearing Verna talk gives me hope. Films like Sabrina's film give me hope. The people in Sabrina's film give me hope. And conversations like this give me hope. That's you know, the impossible is often achievable. If you look at same-sex marriage 15 years ago, I never would have thought in my lifetime that was possible. And then things happen very quickly. And there's 2 centuries, really 4 centuries, if you think about it, of struggle related to these issues in the United States. Change happens slowly, and sometimes you get knocked backwards along the way. But it's also possible that there's a moment where things could happen very quickly in major ways that none of us could have imagined. And we have to keep fighting and grasping for that.
All right, that's a nice point, I think, on which to conclude this conversation. Thanks again to all of you for taking the time out of your day to join in. I want to make one plug depending on when you're watching this out there in the world. Beau is going to be also offering a master class in screenwriting during the St. Louis International Film Festival. That's going to take place on November 21st at 1 p.m. November 21st at 1 p.m. That's entirely free. So I hope that those of you who are interested in his career as a screenwriter and just screenwriting generally will join us. Okay, that's it. I'd like to again thank all of you. Thank you, Sabrina, for making such a wonderful film.
Thank you to you for having us in your festival, and thank you to you, Verna and Beau, to be in this panel with me. I was really impressed. I'm so honored and happy about that.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Bye all.